So it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the 2024 Vincent Strudwick Lecture, which is always on the topic of religion in public life. It's of course fantastic to have Vincent himself here, along with Nina, his wife, and his three daughters, Becky, Alice and Martha, and I know they're here somewhere, I just can't quite see them. Thank you too to the Graduate Theological Foundation, which has provided the funding again for this lecture. Our lecturer this year is the priest and musician, Lucy Winkett, well known to many of you for her much appreciated contributions to the morning radio slot, Thought for the Day. My atheist friends, and frankly quite a lot of my religious friends too, say that Lucy is the only Thought for the Day speaker where they don't reach for the off knob on their radios. That's quite a triumph, Lucy. Lucy is rector of St James's Piccadilly, that glorious Christopher Wren church in the centre of London, which many of you will know, where she has forged an exceptional, inclusive community, where she promotes the arts and brings her imagination to the worship, to public conversations about key topics, one on AI last week, for example, and to innovative projects such as the St James Piccadilly Garden at the Chelsea Flower Show earlier this year. As part of her work there, the church has launched the Wren Transformation Project to restore the historic buildings, rejuvenate and repurpose other buildings, and establish a number of innovative programs, including the Changemaker program for young leaders. And they're raising 20 million and they're over halfway through, so well done, Lucy. Lucy's also priest in charge of St Pancras and chaplain to her near neighbour, the Royal Academy. Prior to going to St James in 2010, Lucy was at St Paul's Cathedral, first as minor canon and then as canon precentor. When she arrived as minor canon in 1997, she was the first female priest to serve at St Paul's, making her a trailblazer. And as some of you will know because you watched the BBC documentary about St Paul's in that period, she initially faced considerable hostility from some of the male priests there, which through her abilities and charm, she overcame. Educated at Cambridge, where she read modern history, she then went to the Royal Academy of Music, where she trained as a singer before going on to study for the ordained ministry at Queen's College, Birmingham, the Ecumenical College. Lucy is the author of Our Sound is Our Wound, which was the Archbishop's Lent book for 2010. Vincent, Lucy and I have, over, I think about the last 30 years, had numerous adventures together. And so it's a very particular pleasure, really, to welcome Lucy to give the 2024 Vincent Strudwick Lecture. And her topic is, Imagine the World to be Different, the Church as an Agent of Change. Change? Note there's a question mark at the end of that. Can the church be a positive agent for change? We eagerly await what you have to say about that, Lucy. After Lucy has given her lecture, there'll be a short time for questions, and then Vincent will, in his traditional fashion, close the formal proceedings so that we can then all enjoy a drink together here in the hub. So please join me in welcoming Lucy Winkett.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you, Vincent, for asking me to give this lecture. It's wonderful to see you all. I've made the trek from central London, from Piccadilly, to speak, as Jane said, on this topic, and the question mark is very important. Every day, like this morning, I say morning prayer not far from the font where the poet and prophet William Blake was baptised in 1757. Itself a remarkable feature, that marble font in the corner of the church, carved by the woodcarver Grinling Gibbons, shows Adam and Eve in, to my eyes, a rather anarchic pose, certainly more bohemian than Puritan, more louche than virginal, draped, which is quite something for first thing in the morning, draped around the trunk of the tree of life, which holds the bowl in which that future excoriator of Christian hubris, William Blake, was as a small baby exorcised, baptised and blessed. At that same font in 1773, a young man stood, having walked up the road from his place of work at the Causeway household in Pall Mall. A 15-year-old, Kwabna Otoba Kuguano, listed in the church registers as John Stewart, 15 years, a black, was baptized at that same font, because as he wrote in his landmark book, Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wickedness of Slavery, some good people advised him to be baptized in order that he may not be carried away again. In fact, so pernicious were the colonial statutes that although it had been true that baptized Christians couldn't be enslaved again, the rules changed multiple times so that baptism did not remain the protection it once was. And so in the time that I've served as rector of St James's Piccadilly, it's in contemplating the preoccupations of Otoba Kuguano and William Blake, to whom I am bound by my own baptism, in a contemporary context, that's led me to an exploration of imagination in the life of the church, divine and human, in what is an even more unequal and complicated city society than the 18th century London, which Kuguano and Blake so fiercely prayed in and simultaneously exposed. In the first part, then, of this consideration of the public value of imagination in church and society, and considering whether the church can be an agent of change, my suggestion will be that it's in the sacramental life of the church that the seeds are sown for this character as a change agent. Baptism and Eucharist are celebrated at the crossroads where time meets eternity. And the power of the sacraments contain all that is needed for the renewal of the church as an agent of change in a hurting world and a suffering society. And so a way into this consideration of the sacramental life of the church is through the stories of these two figures from my context, who knew each other, we think, born in the same year, and who made, in their own ways, incalculable change possible because of the power of their imagination. Very little is known about the life of Otoba Kuguano, alongside the more famous abolitionists in the Sons of Africa movement, such as Olaudah Equiano, whose name is more well known. There's no reliable record of Kuguano's birth, whether he got married or of his death. He has no gravestone. So it seemed important to us to mark the 250th anniversary of his baptism last year by commissioning a plaque to him in the church, carving his name in stone for the first time, anchoring him to the one place that he's known to have been, the 20th of August, 1773, at St James's Church, a Friday that year, being baptised by the Reverend Thomas Skinner from Marylebone, possibly given the European name of a former Prime Minister who had died earlier that year, John Stewart. The contemporary artist Billy Gerard Frank showed his Venice Biennale film at the church as part of the programming around this anniversary. And for many afterwards, the most heartbreaking part of the film was not the confronting story of his kidnap, transportation and enslavement, nor his baptism, freedom and fame as an author, but the sequence right at the beginning of the film, showing a young boy playing with his friends, as Kuguano describes in his book, playing in the fields near his house before the sequence of events that led him to become the articulate and forceful critic of the church and of society, and the powerful agent for change he became. A voice for change that was, as I will explain, rooted in his faith as a Christian. What might have been, Billy Gerard Frank was showing us, what might have been had this human being, mysterious and precious and made in the image of God as every human being, been simply allowed to live, to grow up, to remain free as he was created to be free. The power of the artist's imagination etched itself into the consciousness of all in St James's Church that night, echoing the commission too of the Trinidadian artist Che Lovelace. It seemed important to us, alongside the stone plaque, to act in the present, commission an artist for a permanent addition to the church. And so Che Lovelace was also commissioned. 4 paintings now hang in the narthex, which you can cut through from Jermyn Street to Piccadilly, the entrance to the church, not depicting figuratively the action of baptism, but embodying the theology of baptism for a general audience, including the ritual drowning that baptism includes, by depicting the underwater ambiguous figure of a Caribbean woman. She may be swimming freely, and she may be dead, thrown overboard as so many trafficked Africans were. This second of the paintings, which we'll see later, is called Passage, referencing the middle passage in which so many died, and is powerful as a permanent signifier of the failure of imagination in human beings that convinces lighter-skinned humans that they are somehow superior to darker-skinned humans, and that this catastrophic failure, when combined with greed and protectionism, constructs a system of slavery that is, as Cugoano named it, evil. But the 3rd and 4th paintings, Spirit and The Vision of the Birds, describe imaginatively, as one teenager from a local school who came to see the paintings recently commented, "Imagine a world where slavery had never happened. The joy and freedom and obviousness of it all is infectious, and by its counter-narrative pulls everyone who see it into a new future." In commissioning this artwork, the brief itself wasn't very prescriptive, except to say that we hoped it embodied somehow the spirit and theology of baptism for a general audience, dare I say it, a secular audience, and the character, as far as it can be known, of Ottobah Cugoano. And in the latter concern, much of what can be gleaned or imagined comes from his book. Ottobah Cugoano's book, Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil of Slavery, is a bracing and prophetic read, even today. A Jeremiad, that is, an uncompromising voice raised in fundamental calling to account of, as Cugoano addressed, the inhabitants of Great Britain. He's narrated as an abolitionist, of course, but not often as a theologian, rooted in Christian practice as fundamental as baptism. But it is as this theologian, displaying a strong commitment to both imagination and justice, that I will speak about him for a few moments now. It's the Genesis story of Adam and Eve, so pivotal to Grinling Gibbon's design of that font in which he was baptised, that is the basis for Cugoano's theology too. He takes on the argument popular with some slave traders and slave owners that slavery was justified because humans developed polygenetically, that is, that Africans and Europeans descended from separate pairs of original parents. Inequality was built in from the start, they argued, and so slavery was legitimate. Ottobah Cugoano bases his own refutation of this catastrophic belief on straightforwardly orthodox Christian theology, which is that God created all human beings on the 6th day by creating one humanity in the figures of Adam and Eve. Human beings developed monogenetically. Therefore, inherent equality before God, argues Cugoano, is rooted in the orthodox doctrine of creation. For God who made the world, he wrote, hath made of one blood all the nations of men that dwell on all the face of the earth. His conclusion, rooted in this theology, is that it never could be lawful and just for any nation or people to oppress and enslave another. He takes on 2 pillars too, head on, of theology prevalent throughout much of Christian history, that the mark of Cain denoted inherent inferiority and inequality between people of different ethnic backgrounds. Cugoano faces this head-on alongside other theological assumptions that embedded racial inequality, such as the curse of Ham, one of the sons of Noah. Cugoano insists that in both cases, colour and complexion has nothing to do with that mark. Every wicked man, he says, and the enslavers of others bear the stamp of their own iniquity and that mark which was set upon Cain. The mark of Cain, therefore, according to him, is on the slavers, not the enslaved, and, crucially, is rooted in behaviour, not genetics. By building the theological case alongside a political and practical one, Ottobah Cugoano presents a holistic vision of what a Christian contribution to society can look like. And then finally, he turns his attention to the church itself. That the church itself promotes and protects the trade in human beings is exposed by Cugoano's critique of the theology that supported it. A matter of shame that many Christians did not see any incompatibility between their own slave owning and the Christian gospel. Cugoano's challenge to these fellow Christians is powerful and absolute. Again, his theology is thoroughly orthodox here, with a sharp critique reminiscent of his contemporary William Blake too. Cugoano writes, "Church signifies an assembly of people, but a building of wood, brick or stone where the people meet together is generally called so. And should the people be frightened away by the many abominable dead carcasses which they meet with," he means the clergy, "they should follow the multitudes to the fields, to the valleys, to the mountains, to the islands, to the rivers, and to the ships, and compel them to come in, that the house of the Lord may be filled." He despises the corruption of the clergy, who neglect their duty much, or do it with such supineness that it becomes good for nothing. That there is a way out of this damnable situation, which is laid out for humanity by the sacrifice of Jesus, is a cause of great thanksgiving for Cugoano. He concludes that judgment and vengeance belongs to God, not humans, and that there is a path to salvation for everyone, regardless of their involvement in the abominable slave trade, but only after repentance and change of life. The possibility of this path out of damnation for the slavers only serves to intensify his condemnation of the people practicing and defending slavery in this life. The call to repentance is powerful, and the repentance is practical, political, and personal, as well as spiritual. And towards the end of his book, he sets out a practical plan. He isn't simply theologizing. His practical plan is to abolish all slavery everywhere forever, impose that abolition throughout the world with force, and only then beg for mercy from God, who alone has the power to bring justice to a people who at the moment are very far from salvation. And he sets out a series of days of prayer and lamentation and repentance to achieve this. In deploying a collective imagination for this commission, it was important that the church, we the church, did not try to launder its own reputation by focusing only on Cugoano himself. The reality was that, yes, his book was funded by 140 parishioners who supported and backed his publication, including Joshua Reynolds, the founder of the Royal Academy. But equally, he was sitting beside other parishioners in the church who were at the same time benefiting from the trade and who later on would be paid significant compensation. Research had to be done on them too. The strength of Cugoano's rebuke in this context is all the more impressive. At the heart of the church that itself institutionally benefited from the transatlantic chattel slave trade and coming to the communion rail along with others who were involved, his words, as the first African recorded to call for the total abolition of slavery always and everywhere, imagines a world very different from the one he was in. In August 2018, I was privileged to speak at the recently discovered grave of William Blake in Bunhill Fields as part of the dedication of his first headstone. William Blake was buried largely unknown in 1827, the fifth of 8 bodies to be buried on top of one another with no marker to show where they were. He lay there undisturbed and unrecognised until 2 amateur Blake devotees worked incredibly hard through burial records to find where he was. And so it was on the 191st anniversary of his death that a large crowd gathered in Bunhill Fields. Perhaps it was a sign of the reach of this unique artist that the speakers at his grave included 2 poets, 1 comedian, 1 priest, and the lead singer of Iron Maiden. Each roared at the crowd in true Blakean tigerish style. No microphones in the rainy Bunhill Fields that day. And at the multiple grave, inevitably becoming known as Blake 7, the organisers made sure that all the other paupers buried there were named and honoured alongside their famous bedfellow. Blake would have had it no other way. For Blake, there was no such thing as a category error, and his urgency and compassionate fury was the fuel for his engraving, his words, his mystical experiences, his prophetic verbal whipping of the powerful. But he was baptised, and so I meet him at the sacramental crossroads where time meets eternity, bound across the centuries by the turning to Christ that he fervently wished the church would live out more radically in his day, and I would guess in this. Among the many criticisms of the church, Blake formed his own 11th commandment, which was, "Thou shalt not." Just that. Expressed in his poem, The Garden of Love. I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I had never seen. A chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green. And the gates of this chapel were shut, and "Thou shalt not" writ over the door. So I turned to the Garden of Love that so many sweet flowers bore. And I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. With Ottobah and William as my companions in my imagination then, let's come back to the 21st century. One of my reflections as a jobbing parish priest and pastor is that the church isn't so much dying, or at least its dying is patchy and not at all as it's portrayed in the media, but the church is grieving for a simpler past that probably never existed, where everyone believed the same things in the same ways, and Christian assumptions about, for example, mercy, love, and forgiveness were commonplace. It seems to me, in a current climate of damaging and often false fantasies about the past, and a nostalgic yearning for a simpler and fairer world in the future, it's especially incumbent upon the church not to be the mouthpiece for a loosely expressed "things ain't what they used to be." Contested history and honest looks at our past are essential. So in speaking about cultural bereavement, amnesia, or ignorance as identified by both novelists and theologians, I don't want to suggest a return to any particular cultural reality, but a commitment instead to cultivate the generative, renewing imagination which is inherent in Christianity. My suggestion then is that the renewing of the church in society is rooted in the sacraments, for Anglicans, baptism and Eucharist, and that the power and influence of both have been somewhat forgotten by an over-anxious church, losing confidence in liturgical principles, either in actual liturgy or in reinterpreting those liturgical principles for other sorts of gatherings. And the working out of this sacramental character and identity is always contextual. And so a word about the context from which I'm speaking, where I minister. Right by Piccadilly Circus, St James's Piccadilly ministers a pastoral ministry in a shockingly unequal city centre, a parish of extremes where people I know bed down outside the Ritz and other people I know run it. Second, a rootedness in the particular context of the historic Anglican church settlement brought to life in the buildings of the late 17th century architect Christopher Wren, in whose buildings I've served for over 25 years, where the window glass is clear so that the light of reason must fall on the practice of religion, where the auditory and visual cues mean that scripture and prayers are heard in the vernacular, with no little side chapels for a priest to hide away and mutter in Latin. But where the embellishment of the two remaining sacraments is lavish, a little outrageous, teeming with references to the natural world, carved in limewood by the Anglo-Dutch carver Grinding Gibbons, and soaked, it seems, in late 17th century relief that the religious wars might be coming to an end, and that order has been somehow brought out of chaos. Third, a sense that imagination is a gift sorely needed in society and church, that imagination is given great significance in Christianity, rooted in the foundational Hebrew concepts of repair of the earth and the future-oriented travel to the promised land, and by way of the gospel accounts of the life of storytelling, parable inventiveness of the poet-preacher Jesus of Nazareth. And that we, 2,000 years later, are still really in the early church. Fourth, that the particular moment we find ourselves in now, a late modern, mature capitalist society with a sophisticated electorate and a public conversation continually being transformed by social media with values shaped unseen by AI, is one where the language and life of the church is, as Iris Murdoch put it as far back as 1970, not so much abandoned as unknown. The majority of people in the UK live their lives without reference to organised religion. Importantly, we in the UK, though, are out of step with the rest of the world, where 85% of the global population practice a religion, some more furiously than ever. And fifth, that the yearnings expressed by many in the public square, in politics, in leadership of economic and business institutions, in the cultural industries, these yearnings could be given a home in an open-hearted church, but that the church has by and large failed to remain a home for these hopes, imaginings and yearnings, because of, this is my personal view, the both rigid and relentless focus on doctrine, the disproportionate attention given to sexual ethics, and the institutional drag that this engenders, along with anxiety-driven, narrow definitions of mission, often infused not by joy, but by fear and determination not to cede control. The opportunity before us as church is thrilling, theologically, liturgically, and practically. Baptism makes us fearless. And the opportunity before us in the church is to claim the fearlessness that baptism offers us. And the Eucharist is a future-oriented sacrament, not a memorial service. Both require the power of human imagination to be placed at the feet of the God whose sacramental presence in the world is largely unnoticed and under-narrated by the church. a short story to illustrate the power of imagination in the life of the church and the loss of the church's influence over time in this sphere. Just 3 weeks ago, at the beginning of October, a female pilot whale and her calf swam down the Thames and got stranded. This happens from time to time. And the national church had no comment to make, unsurprisingly. No action was taken, none was expected. But this has not always been the case. In the 10th century, a whale swam down the Thames and got stuck. Because of the preaching from the Christian pulpits of London that the creature Leviathan in the Psalms was a symbol of evil, because of the preaching from Christian pulpits that the whale that swallowed Jonah was a symbol of evil, Londoners set upon the whale and killed it. In 1657, a whale swam down the Thames and got stuck. Because of the preaching from Christian pulpits that Leviathan from the Psalms was a symbol of evil, and because of the Puritan Protectorate's belief in portents and signs direct from God, Londoners set upon the whale and killed it. It was later claimed as a portent of the death of Richard Cromwell, retrospectively. In 2006, a whale swam down the Thames and got stuck. Crowds gathered on the banks of the river. People wept as rescue attempts failed. And when the whale died, her skeleton was put on display at the Natural History Museum, and a play was written about her and performed at the Royal Court Theatre. The church's prayers, such as they were couched in terms of human interdependence with all creation and repentance for the damage done by greed. As a result of the evolution of our beliefs about whales and what they represent, the prayers and actions of ordinary people changed towards exactly the same event, which happened in the 10th century, in the 17th century, and in the 21st century. Imagination, when deployed in the service of the church, then, is a powerful and effective force in the world. It isn't just a whimsical set of musings on the endless possibilities before us, or simply a statement of faith in the power of art. The habitual inclusion explicitly of imagination in the life of a faith community makes life much more challenging, more complex, sometimes overwhelming, because it seems that everything is possible all the time. But it also encourages risk-taking and a cycle of action, reflection, confession and absolution, and subsequent freedom for action again that makes possible the building of community rooted in the future-oriented communal action of the Eucharist. At St. James's, we have a strategy with reporting dashboards and, dare I say it, KPIs, key performance indicators, but we are trying hard not to make these tools just expressions of our own functional atheism. We're not relying on these strategies to be the beginning and end of what we do. We try, often don't succeed, but we try not to live and plan as if God doesn't exist, although that's a huge challenge in a church that institutionally and rightly is subject to all the checks, balances and challenges of any registered charity in a big city. But our theological talk of imagination in faith and society is obviously not morally neutral in itself. As we're warned in Mary's song, God has scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. It took imagination to think of a form of execution as cruel and public as crucifixion. It takes imagination to craft a view of the future that rests on prejudicial assumptions. Imagination untethered to a communal and accountable liturgical life is powerful and dangerous in its power. It could be categorized as one of Karl Barth's lordless powers. Imagination is a gift that must always be placed at the feet of the one who made that imagination in the first place, which means it belongs and finds its home in liturgy. The emphasis on imagination as a tool for the future of the church always sails close to idolatry and always sails close to functional atheism. Because the power of human imagination is so extraordinary when unfettered or unaccountable that it can drive a sort of vacuous overactivity. where more is always more, and can be formed into a programme of actions that has no end. But imagination, like any gift to humanity, invites a constant process of offering, attention, judgment, and redemption by blessing from God. And so redeemed imagination is that which recognises the link between beauty and justice as expressed in the liturgy of the Church, and trust in the sacraments. In considering the Church's potential as an agent of change, then, my suggestion is that we keep the discipline necessary in returning to the source, not trying to do things in ever more imaginative ways for the sake of it. We are not required to think up ever more attractive ways to do stuff, an all-singing, all-dancing Eucharist on ice. But at the same time, if I may make a comment about church culture, aren't we expert at forming what might be called unjoinable communities because of that grief I mentioned near the beginning. The Church, as a collection of communities in our localities, find that it's easy to lose our confidence because we live in a society that's not that interested in anything we have to say, because we are all, in church or not, as the jargon goes, vulnerable adults. This room is full of them. Of course, we compete, we want to survive, we want to be thought of as successful. But to live forward, if I can call it like this, immersed in the waters of baptism, mean that this sacramental identity can direct and rule our hearts, keep us faithful, teach us to trust, help us to believe. And as for the Eucharist, we domesticate it at our peril. The Roman Catholic liturgist Aidan Kavanagh captures this very well, holding the tension within the Eucharist between banquet, abundance, and sacrifice the night before he died. Another way of expressing, I think, the twin foundations of beauty and justice, needing both. He writes this: table manners at the Eucharist depend upon something's having been grabbed by the throat. A knowledge ignorant of these dark and murderous gestures charged with soul is sterile rather than elegant, artifice rather than art. It is love without passion, the church without a cross, a house with a dining room but no kitchen, a feast of frozen dinners, a heartless life. So there is a logic to this set of reflections that give a sort of action, reflection, action circle that characterises where the Church's offer can be for society. Sacraments renew society and Church if not over-controlled by the Church. Eucharist is a future-oriented sacrament and baptism makes us fearless. And second, take this sacramental life out of the building into a society where most people live their lives without organised religion. So how? Tell people that the Church is a place to make promises and keep them. That the Church is a place to face the reality of evil and renounce it. That the Church is a place to try to be as honest as we can about who we are and what we have done, and live as those who are forgiven and free. Take Eucharistic principles and translate them into other gatherings, where all are welcome, where all are fed, where the table is set and new community is made every time, and do not be squeamish about money that is part of it. The Church in conversation mode and invitation mode, in celebrations that are broken-hearted, knowing that the hardest laughs are at a funeral. People are longing for the Church to be serious, not trivial, yearning for the preacher not to say something devastating, and yearning for meaning. the church in conversation mode and invitation mode, in celebration and lament mode, not in lecturing mode or as an agent of social control. Our chief calling then as church in society, I want to suggest, is not so much to strategize or plan, come to a policy conclusion, or even keep the show on the road, although of course within the course of a week we'll spend some time doing some of those things. It's to tell stories together and find new ways forward that release, not confine, that say yes more often than no, that operate from a conviction that abundance is our reality. And so a couple of stories just to finish, and then a couple of pictures. Talking of early mornings, I find myself one weekday a couple of weeks ago at a business breakfast talking about the power of imagination in the boardroom. Slipping in some theology, I hope, under the wire, we speak amongst ourselves about the recruitment, retention and strategic challenges for the various business people in the room, from the communications industries to retail to the art trade. They speak movingly about their desire to embed values as strong motivation for their board's decision-making, as important as delivering a successful result each quarter for the bottom line. They speak too about the challenges of holding on to those values when that scourge of business planning, uncertainty, has now become the new normal. There is a sense that they want to find a way to generate value, of course, but are acutely aware of the dangers of this being the driving. I've noticed there's always a lot of driving in these business conversations, force that can end in the assumption that greed is good. I leave the room, ready for the rest of the day, feeling that somehow I've experienced a version of morning prayer, with readings, canticles, and responses expressing the lived contradictions of leadership in the world today. Just as I do in the church's morning prayer, listening to the accounts of the kings, the prophets, the wars and politics of Herod, the economics of Lydia, Zacchaeus, Matthew, and Mary Magdalene, the unsettling stories told by Jesus about judges and widows, armies, shopkeepers, and farmers. Faith in God is revealed and renewed in this group, none of whom are involved with church, but all of whom are imaginative and kind and yearn to make the world a better place. None of them see the church as a home for their yearnings and hopes for this world. A final picture from a book, This Here Flesh, by Cole Arthur Riley, which to me speaks of the Eucharist. She writes, "One day, at the end of all things, the legs of all the tables in the world will come alive. And without apology, they'll each begin plodding towards the space where the top and bottom of the earth meet. And we'll be terrified, of course, so some of us will go into hiding underground. But some, after pausing to feel sad or terrified or betrayed, will get brave and follow them. Those who are able to withstand the pilgrimage, who are able to push back despair in the company of the tableless, will make it to where they're going. And when they arrive, they'll find all of the moving tables lined up into one great plank, tracing the entire equator. The children will sit first, because they are unafraid. And the elders will follow, because they are unafraid of their fear. And eventually everyone will take a seat, squashing their elbows in tight. Some will be grunting, complaining about how absurd the whole thing is. Some will be laughing in awe of how beautiful it is. And some will be crying, sensing how familiar it all is. And in mystery, and all at once, we'll look up from the table and we'll see ourselves. At that moment, the wood of the table will begin to suck all the shame out of the air. And once it does, the air will become so light that we will all realize how little we've been able to move in our own bodies before this moment. when we understand that the food is not going to fall from the clouds or manifest from the knots in the table, we'll take ourselves and wander off to collect things. And we'll probably get lost now and again, but the table will just send out a long whistle and lead us back. Liberation is not a finality or an end point. It is an unending awakening. It's something we can both meet and walk away from within the same hour. Our responsibility to ourselves is to become so familiarized with it, so attuned to its wounds, that when it calls out to us, we will know which way the table is. So right at the end, I'd just like to show a couple of pictures, because words are all very well. The theory is all very well, but it only makes sense if you try it. I try hard to think of the church as a laboratory, as a risk taker, and as a community committed to doing something, not just thinking about it. It means that we get a lot wrong, but truly an open-hearted attempt to take some risks creatively, in the conviction that creativity is in itself a language of the human spirit. So Che Lovelace's paintings in honour of Kwabena Ottobah Cugoano, 4 paintings, hang in the narthex of St James's. And it's the second one I was speaking about, passage, where the figure is ambiguous, as Che says. He's not certain if she is dead or free, maybe both. And just so we don't run away with our artistic heads on, that's the back office. I won't go through it all, but there's more spreadsheets than you can possibly imagine. I just wanted to mention the power of having public sacred space open and accessible 7 days a week. That's hard, but it's important. Last week, a woman called Jo Berry came to the church to have a conversation with Patrick McGee. Jo Berry's father was killed in the Brighton bomb 40 years ago, and Patrick McGee was the man who planted the bomb. Immediately after the death of her father 40 years ago, she came to St James's and sat in the church because it was open, and pledged herself on that day, 2 days after he died, that she would somehow work for peace. 40 years later, she came and met the bomber in our church. That can happen in any open, public, sacred space. You never know what decisions are taken if your church is open. And again, being ordinary is, for the church anyway, is really important. To take the sacraments out of the building, public ashing on Ash Wednesday, reading books together, obviously, is an obvious one. Lots of donkeys outside down Piccadilly, outside for a dawn Eucharist at Easter with an immersive Triduum liturgy, so an all-night vigil. None of this is rocket science. It's all actually very traditional. And I think that's what I'm trying to say, to find the ancient paths and introduce them to a younger generation. At Piccadilly Circus, handing out Easter eggs to bleary-eyed bus drivers. And that creativity is in itself a language of the human spirit. On the night that one of the General Synod votes that said that bishops were not going to permit priests to bless same-sex relationships, on that night, St James's had a concert by the amazing singer John Grant, who sings very powerfully about that very subject. And Victoria Canal, who's sung amazingly about body dysmorphia and her own story. So that creativity is in itself a language of the human spirit means that we will invest in a creative programme. And as Jane mentioned, the Chelsea Flower Show, quite an amazing experience. Not one I think I'm going to repeat, but an amazing thing. And to put William Temple's quote up there for everyone at the Chelsea Flower Show. The church exists primarily for the benefit of those who do not belong to it on the outside wall of the garden, to see thousands of people taking a photograph of that quote. I hope it's on Facebook pages and Instagram feeds throughout the country. And drag, which we have got into in the last year in the Pride March and Eucharist. Important to invite the neighbours in. That's how we saw it from Soho. This is the Quobna Ottawa Kugawano dedication of the plaque with Rosemary Mallet, the Bishop of Croydon. And putting all of this into practice, helping accompany people through the gruelling asylum system, is a very important part of how we're operating as part of that confrontation of modern slavery today, particularly in the spirit of Ottawa Kugawano. And a hot weekly meal for people going through homelessness, but importantly, in the place of the altar, in front of the Grindon Gibbons carving, where we talk a lot. I've had conversations there in the past about the English Civil War, or the merits of Oliver Cromwell, or the carving that is in front of people, not just talking about being homeless. And earth justice, again, getting out, beating the bounds, again, a thoroughly traditional thing to do, but doing it in an imaginative way. And a food market and a incarceration reform programme through Redemption Roasters, the best named cafe I could think of, who give placements and employment to people straight out of prison. And now we've just started a programme called Conversations Under Trees, in the conviction that a conversation you might have outside under a tree is going to have a different character, perhaps, from that in a boardroom, or even in a therapeutic room, or in the study of a vicar, or over a kitchen table even. So the church in conversation mode, as I mentioned, invitation mode, rather than doctrinal mode. And as Jane mentioned, our first one was on AI last Thursday, and on Saturday we had a day festival called Canopy. And at the end of each of our events, what we want to do is, rather than conclude and come to an answer, we ask our congregational audience, what's the next question, to keep the conversation going. I've overrun my time, but thank you for your indulgence. I hope there's some questions. Thanks very much.
It's your turn now, Vincent.
Lucy, thank you very, very much for what you've offered us today. Over the last years, these lectures have been an attempt to bring together a multitude of people of difference, good difference. And from our founding president onwards, that has been something Kellogg College has sought to value and perform. It seems clear to me at this stage that while that has been something for which a whole lot of people have given thanks for, the time for it to come under my name has finished. What was appropriate and what I understood, we now move into, in the imagination, to a new future that I find it hard to understand. And therefore, something will emerge in the college and in its tradition which will be different, and which perhaps my children, grandchildren will understand but I won't. I mean, I've no idea now what half of them do for their jobs, and I don't understand their language, and they don't understand mine. But so I think that time for turnover has come, and I look forward to being part of the college still, and part of a tradition, but in listening mode, in listening and learning mode. Finally, you talked a good deal about imagination, and I had a sort of wonderful fantasy of imagination, because the one thing I've got left, nothing works in my body now except my voice, and I could still sing. And I had a sort of feeling that if I began, say, Mozart's Marriage of Figaro, Si vol ballare signor con, that you might join in. And that we would have a duet. Or if you didn't do that, there's always Flanders and Swan. So, mainly, thank you all. Thank you all in the fellowship and in the audience tonight for coming. And I look forward, because of all this, I look forward to the future with hope and with joy. Thank you.
If this is the last Vincent Strudwick Lecture in this form, as Vincent has suggested, then I think it's been powerful and important to have Lucy Winkett as the final speaker in the series. She is an extremely important voice in the church, as you will have realised before you came here tonight, I'm sure, but also even if you've only heard her for the first time tonight, fighting against the franchise model, allowing people to be free in their faith and flowing from their baptism, and being utterly creative in what she does. My only regret is I don't live close enough to Lucy to go and worship at St James's Piccadilly every Sunday, which I would adore to do. So if you're in the vicinity, do go and see what they're up to, because it really is a model of extraordinarily imaginative, forward-looking faith. So thank you for your voice generally in society and the church, and thank you specifically for a superb lecture and your presence with us tonight, Lucy. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.